and welcome to Rising. Brianna Joy Gray is off again today, and so I am joined by Jessica Burbank. Happy Halloween, Jessica.
I decided to be something very scary, Robbie. I'm the left chair on Rising today.
Continues to strike fear into my heart. Why don't you get us started on the show?
Well, Robbie, Speaker Mike Johnson is already meeting some stiff opposition to his multi-billion-dollar Israel war funding bill. It offsets $14.3 billion in Israel aid with $14.3 billion in cuts to the IRS from the Inflation Reduction Act. Per Punchbowl News' Jake Sherman, this offset will never ever fly, as Democrats will reject it out of hand. The measure would make cuts to tax enforcement operations, support free file for taxpayers, Office of Tax Policy, and tax court. Taxpayer services are exempted from cuts.
Now, per the White House, there's plenty of money to go around for both Israel and Ukraine without needing to cut domestic spending. Let's see what they're saying.
Is the president open to considering any spending offsets for that funding?
So look, I'm certainly not going to get into hypotheticals from here, but what I can say is,
House Republicans are calling for that right
now. I understand that. I hear you. What we've been very clear about is that we want to see both move forward. We want to see both of the requests that we've made in the supplemental for the national security. We want to see both move forward because it is vital as those two countries are fighting for their democracies.
So spending offsets, is that on the table?
Look, these are emergency funding requests, right? We've been very clear about that. Like other emergency funding that Congress has passed with bipartisan support, they do not require offsets. They just don't.
However, some Republicans say they're willing to go nuclear over domestic spending cuts. Representative Chip Roy of Texas told Fox News he'd be willing to let the government shut down over it.
Speaker Johnson has a lot of work to do to get appropriations bills done over the next 2.5 weeks and to set the table for an actual debate in front of the American people about making sure we take our country back and stop spending money that's driving up inflation, killing our economy, funding all manners of world engagements, and continuing to leave our border wide open for exploitation by terrorists and all manners of dangerous individuals that can harm us.
Well, reading between the lines, it sounds like you are a holdout again, and that you are quite prepared to shut the government down. You are, aren't you? Yes,
well,
you are.
Let me just say, let me say, Stuart, the question here is, do you believe that we should continue to fund a United Nations that literally just stood with Hamas? Should we continue to fund a wide open border that is endangering my constituents, where people are dying from fentanyl? Should we continue to fund the World Health Organization and all of these leftist organizations and rags that have been undermining our ability to have healthcare freedom around the world? These are questions that we should be answering. And continuing resolution of a bloated $1.7 trillion spending bill that's driving the inflation that you report on every single day, dealing with the market conditions and the problems in our economy because our government irresponsibly spends money. No, I'm not going to blindly saddle up and say, sure, let me write another blank check.
Up in the higher chamber, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has publicly opposed Speaker Johnson's decision to separate Israel from Ukraine funding. Yesterday, he lobbied in support of sending more taxpayer dollars to fight what he calls a, quote, existential war in Eastern Europe.
So this is not solely about helping Ukraine. It's also about getting us ready for the bigger challenges we have ahead out in Asia. Right now, our efforts are making a difference, both in Ukraine and here at home. But the Biden administration's hesitation along the way has really, in my view, kind of prolonged the bloodshed. This is a moment for swift and decisive action to prevent further loss of life and to impose real consequences on the tyrants who terrorize the people of Ukraine and of Israel. And right now, the Senate has a chance to produce supplemental assistance that will help us do exactly that.
I'm not sure what McConnell is saying there. Hesitation on the Democrats' side. The Democrats want to fund, sheer nearly unlimited funding for Ukraine, are prepared to send more funding to Israel as well. Some Republicans, pushing back on that, certainly pushing back on the Ukraine side of it, and now saying that if we're going to spend money in Israel, we should offset it with cuts elsewhere. Look, I want cuts to the tax police anyway. But I would save that money and just give it back to the American people. I think taxpayers are fed up having to pay for other nations' security. Why aren't they capable of doing it themselves? Israel's a very wealthy country. We've already given Ukraine a lot of money. It doesn't actually seem to me like Ukraine is any closer to defeating Russia in this war than they were at any other earlier part. And Israel, has enjoyed more support from the U.S. than any other country for the last half century. So I think the American people are fed up with it, and I'm glad that I think Republicans more than Democrats realize that something needs to change in terms of the foreign policy. But of course, there is still a lot of support for sending this money overseas in both parties.
Yeah, Mike Johnson should have known that it would be a complete poison pill to include cuts to the IRS funding that came in through the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. Democrats love one thing, and it is bleeding taxpayers dry, turning them over, shaking them out so all of the money falls out of their pockets, and then using those dollars for public spending. We don't have to do it that way. But let's be real. What they're doing with this IRS money is trying to target the wealthiest people in our population that owe a lot of money in back taxes. They've recuperated about $160 million so far. The $14.3 billion going towards the IRS needs to be justified by the amount of money they get in back taxes from the wealthiest people in the country that tend to skirt their tax obligations. So I can see why they want to protect this money they've allocated to the IRS for that purpose, to perhaps even the playing field for the sake of having a more reasonable democracy where the wealthiest people can't place ads and can't donate a ton of money to primary races and election races down the ballot, electoral races down the ballot, so that they can determine the outcome with all of their dollars. I get why they want to fund the IRS. $14.3 billion to Israel, though. That money is going towards strengthening the Iron Dome, developing an iron beam, and more defense for Israel. If the way forward for the United States that they want to push in the region is to arrive at some kind of solution, some kind of agreement between the Palestinian people and the Israeli people, and figure out what to do with the Netanyahu government, why would they still need to protect Israel with an iron dome or an iron beam? It seems that the United States is not anticipating peace in the future. It seems that it's not their goal. That's why they're allocating this money for precisely that. And Mitch McConnell pointing out the existential crisis in Ukraine, I think that's a good way of putting it, because it seems like a war that can never be won. And it seems like a drain of US dollars consistently year over year. If we're fighting against, Ukraine versus Russia, Russia's military dwarfs that of Ukraine. We can't afford to be in a war for 10 years when we think about the amount of US dollars. Maybe they think they can afford additional billions right now, but where's the end game? There is none. And I think that's precisely the problem with throwing more American dollars into this war. It's time to draw some lines in the sand there. So I think Mitch McConnell actually makes a pretty good point on that front. So I don't really see this moving forward. They're going to need to figure out somewhere else to get the money from in order to prevent another government shutdown, but it seems it's heading that way.
Yeah, we're going to talk more about what's going on in Ukraine later in the show today, so I'll save that discussion for a bit. You're hearing from Republicans like Chip Roy that shutting down the government could be on the table. Obviously, many conservative MAGA people who have empowered the Republican Party to retake the House in the most recent midterms are very, very concerned about out of control spending, our out of control debt, want government reined in. Of course, you can't just balance the budget by ending foreign aid, although I think that would be a perfectly good place to start. You'd have to also rein in both defense spending and entitlement spending. And, everybody likes the idea of the government spending less money or fixing our debt in theory. But then when you start saying, oh, does this mean I have to deal with cuts to this program or cuts to this service, or I'm not, my benefits are going to be impacted, then people start to whine and complain. But the fact is we'll never get government spending within its means the way every organization, every individual is supposed to, unless we find a way to either pay for the services we actually want, if that's indeed what we want, or we have to shrink how much we're spending. And I think there's a lot we could do on both the entitlement front and the defense front. And for good measure, we can cut this foreign aid, even though it wouldn't make a large difference in terms of the debt overall. It's a very small percentage of the debt. It's clearly what the American people want Why does Israel need to? Why do we need to pay for their security anymore? We've been very generous. It's not, when government allocates money for Israel, Ukraine, or any other cause, like it's not their money. The political figures are not, reaching into their pocketbooks and like giving up their money. It's my money and your money and the American taxpayers' money. So they've been asked to be they've not been asked, they've been forced to be very generous. And I think a lot of people are sick of it.
On the front of public spending and having a balanced budget, I think our members of Congress are defining a balanced budget in the absolute wrong way. They think that we need to be bringing in more revenue than we're spending on a consistent basis in terms of taxes and public spending, and that's just not the case. No government with a fiat currency, so a government that issues its own currency, has ever had to default on their debt, except in the cases where they've had a fixed exchange rate. We don't. We have a floating exchange rate. The US dollar is doing pretty well globally. It always has. And I don't see us having a fixed exchange rate ever being a case in the future. So when we think about the obligations that we have, the treasury bonds that we have issued, we will always be able to make good on those obligations because the US government issues the currency. When we think about public spending, I'm more concerned about what are our priorities? What are we spending things on? What justifies government dollars being spent is, will it lead to more economic productivity in the future? We just had a pretty significant GDP growth at around 4%. We haven't had rampant inflation like was projected when they saw the government spending that was authorized by Congress. We really need to take this budget and say a budget is balanced when we are spending enough dollars into the economy so that we achieve our productive capacity. And the amount of productivity created by the dollar spent, it takes money to make money, to put people to work, to buy land, machinery, and tools. That money being spent into the economy will increase productivity, which justifies the dollars being put in. That is how you run a functioning economy. No members of Congress look at it that way. They think we need to bring in every single dollar in taxes that we spend, and it's just not the case. It's not how economics works. And very few members of Congress see this as the constraint because they don't have the moral backbone to say that they would rather spend things on or spend US dollars on things like the war in Ukraine rather than on our elderly population retiring. And instead of saying that that's really where their morality lies, they would rather say we don't have the money to go around and we have to make some tough decisions. And that's just not reality.
Well, I think most economists do believe that if you just continue to print more and more money, you do cause inflation. You say inflation has been curbed right now, but we have had a massive inflationary problem recently. Americans were feeling that pain in terms of purchasing gas and food and all sorts of things. So I don't know that you can't just keep issuing money forever. You end up like any of the myriad nations that have seen their currency become worthless because they tried to handle things that way. I see what you're saying, but I think that I think it's important to remember that the government doesn't know how to build anything. I mean, they don't even allow people to build things. Right now, we're held up in terms of our industrial capacity, in terms of building new housing, new everything by red tape everywhere. It takes impossibly long to do. We can't do anything in this country because the government has made it literally illegal or impossible. So I think about all the ways our government is thwarting production, is thwarting economic growth, and if they would get out of the way, not in terms of the spending even, but in terms of just restrictions, it would be so that people can work and people can live and people can have more grocery stores and more factories if that's what it takes to get people back to work. Although on that front, it seems almost impossible given all of the restrictions that go into making that a reality again. So.
Yeah, for most of these countries that have experienced inflation because of public spending, they haven't spent in the direction of understanding what the constraints are. Of course, there's limitations to public spending. We don't have an infinite credit card. We can't print dollars as we want. And the constraint for that are those dollars going to mobilizing our productive capacity that we're currently leaving on the table by having a population of people unemployed. The unemployed population could very well be put to work. We have enough things that we need to make. As you pointed out, there's a lot of demands. Microchips were one of the biggest things that we needed. And to bring a lot of that production home was a goal of the Biden administration, but they didn't do a great job because They don't have trained workers to do the production in the capacity that's necessary to meet demand. But of course, more investment would have helped that, so that they could pay skilled laborers instead of having to hire at much lower wages with the constraints they had for operating. Raising interest rates has been a huge constraint, especially for small businesses in the United States. Again, another thing the federal government could control. They could reduce interest rates, increase public spending in the direction of addressing the demand needs created during supply chain constraints during COVID. And they really could have resolved the economy through public spending. Honestly, spending more in a time of economic crisis can get the economy going again. They kept saying that the labor market was too hot without realizing that inflation was not caused by workers asking for more money than getting more wages and spending money into the economy. Inflation was caused because of supply chain constraints related to the pandemic. And so they really didn't have policy solutions that were relevant to the problem at hand. And the way they manage the economy has always gone in the direction of this. And instead, I think they need to think critically about, okay, what can we afford to do? What is our productive capacity? How many workers are looking for a job? And what does our economy need? Do we need more infrastructure? Do we need more microchips created? Do we need to transition to green energy? There's a lot of things that we can do with that productive capacity. But I think lobbying is a big reason why they don't. They're paid not to. They're paid to allow the current industries that dominate the American economy to thrive. And so I think ending that lobbying is an important step forward. Matt Gaetz advocated for this, and he also advocated for breaking up public spending so that our members of Congress are actually accountable for what they want to spend money on. It's breaking that spending up into separate bills instead of lumping it together like Joe Biden really wants them to do with this foreign spending here.
Now we'll continue this discussion in a bit. More Rising right after this.